to me. Talk to me.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Talk Climate to Me, episode 3, the online edition. Thank you once again for joining us. My name is Rebecca, and I'm thrilled to be with you today. Just as a reminder, we have a worksheet available for you for episode 3, as well as a bunch of handy dandy resources. Those are all in the video description. That includes a participant resources doc where you can pop in all the resources that you want to share with other Talk Climate to Me participants. All right, let's dive in. I'm joining you again from near Orangeville, Ontario, which is the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Peton, Anishinaabe, and Mississauga peoples, including treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is now home to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from across Turtle Island. I'm coming to you from my home, and having access to land is a privilege that has come at the direct and painful cost to Indigenous peoples. Canada's legacy of colonialism continues to this day, perhaps most visibly in the lack of access to safe water and the horrific history of residential schools. We can't talk about climate without Indigenous rights. They go hand in hand. Here's a staggering fact. Indigenous peoples today make up about 5% of the world's population, and yet they protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. So how is that possible? Well, thanks to sophisticated Indigenous science and land stewardship practices honed over thousands of years. But Indigenous communities have been systematically removed from their lands and prevented from practicing these stewardship activities. Many Indigenous nations were prohibited from practicing cultural burning, and this has directly led to an increase in the severity of forest fires today. One act of decolonization for our country is to put decision-making power back into the hands of these communities. When Indigenous communities exercise sovereignty over their lands, they protect them from the threats of climate change. This week, the invitation is for all of us to reflect on how we have benefited from colonialism. It can be uncomfortable, but it's important that we face this legacy. And we also encourage you to think about how you can actively work towards decolonization. So check out the Land Back movement and Indigenous land defenders. We'll also share a link to a short documentary on Indigenous-led conservation. So that link is in the video description. All right, let's once again give ourselves the gift of slowing down, of being present and settling into our bodies. Let's do a couple rounds of box breathing. Maybe you've done this before. We'll breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, and hold again for 4, like a box. So let's close our eyes, and together we'll breathe in for 1, 2, 3, 4, hold for 2, 3, 4, breathe out 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4. Try one more round on your own. All right, when you're ready, open your eyes. Okay, so let's do a quick refresher from last episode. So some kiddos told us why it matters that the planet is overheating and reminded us that we're already experiencing climate change. We heard about environmental racism in Canada and how marginalized communities who have contributed the least to this problem are most affected by climate change. We talked about being at a fork in the road. One path leads to runaway climate change with truly heartbreaking outcomes. The other path, though, takes us to a climate-safe future. It's a lot of work to get there, but we have the technology to achieve this goal, and frontline communities are already leading the way. But the time to act is now. We are Generation Climate. We then took a moment to remember that grieving and breathing are important parts of this work. We then finished the day by measuring our carbon footprints. Understanding how our daily activities contribute to carbon pollution sets us up to better understand the larger system, which leads us to today. Because We know that our individual actions won't protect us from runaway climate change on their own. We do require larger systemic change. So today we're going to zoom out and see what that means for us as a country. So today is all about changes. For instance, if we want to create a flourishing climate safe future, what actually needs to change within the larger systems? What's stopping us from making these changes? And how can we as individuals and communities push for these big systems to change? So let's look at emissions in Canada. As we mentioned last week, on average, one person in Canada produces about 14 tons of carbon pollution. That's like 14 buses full of CO2. But if we were to compare Canada to all countries, how do you think we're doing? Here's what one person on the street told us.
How do you think we're doing in terms of the steps that we're taking towards reducing our carbon footprint?
Yeah, there's so much further to go. I think that we are more conscientious, at least, than a lot of other countries globally. I've only ever lived in Canada myself. I only know this world that we've lived in this whole time. And I do think Canada is better, but there's still so much further that we need to go.
So what do you think? In your head, rank where you think Canada is in terms of climate action. 5 is that, we're awesome. 1 is not so much. Okay, now that you have that number in your head, did you know that 89% of Canadians think Canada is doing great on climate change? That's kind of natural, right? Canadian identity is all about the great white north, endless forest, sea to shining sea. It feels like we should be climate leaders, right? Well, the embarrassing truth is that Canada is actually falling behind. In fact, we're the 3rd worst in the world in terms of emissions per capita, meaning climate pollution produced per person. We like this chart because it breaks down where our emissions come from, but you'll notice that it doesn't include the US and Australia. But as we mentioned last time, their per capita emissions are actually similar to Canada's. So that's per person. What if you look at the total amount of carbon pollution overall? We're a small country, we must be low, right? Nope, Canada is still in the top 10. That is not a top 10 list I want to be a part of. And as Canadians, we often lean on, at least we're doing better than the US. Well, sorry to disappoint, but the US is lapping us in terms of climate action. Their emissions have decreased by more than 10% since 2000. Yes, it should be way more, but in Canada, our GHG emissions have increased. Now, we hear lots of excuses, like how it's cold here, but they just don't hold up. Look at how these cold countries are doing. Yep, looks like we're not doing so great after all. That's Canada in orange, with Norway in purple on a downward trend. While Norway also still has lots to do in reducing fossil fuel exports, they're still doing more than us in terms of climate action. And Sweden's emissions have dropped about 20% since 2000. Remember last time how we said everyone needs to act in order to get to a climate safe future? Well, that's particularly the case for wealthy countries like Canada. We're polluting way more than our fair share. We create about 1.5% of total climate pollution, but we're only 0.5% of the world's population. We're punching way above our weight in a very bad way. In fact, Canada is the only G7 nation where emissions are increasing. So where are all these emissions coming from? This is the total greenhouse gas emissions or climate pollution released by each sector for Canada as a whole. The oil and gas sector produces 26% emissions overall, but transportation is almost as high. And it's not just big trucks hauling our stuff around. Personal vehicles are a big part of that. In fact, in the city of Toronto, 80% of transportation emissions comes from personal vehicles. Heavy industry and buildings stand around 11 and 12% each. Agriculture is at about 10%. Electricity is close behind at 8%. And waste and other sources of emissions bring up the rear at 7%. And what's not so great is that oil and gas and transportation emissions continue to increase. Remember the increase in Canada's overall GHG emissions we talked about earlier? The combination of oil sands and other random factors, such as the fact that Canadians buy the gas guzzlingest, most climate polluting cars on the planet, are really driving these increases. Get it? Driving? Fortunately, there is a good news story here. Do you see that yellow line? It shows how pollution from creating electricity has dropped significantly. This is largely because of the closing down of coal-fired electricity plants. In Ontario, we used to have 5 coal-powered plants, and now we have 0. Some of you will be old enough to remember smog days, when the sky was yellow and we were told not to go running because the air was dirty. Those all but disappeared after the last coal plant shut down. We have made big environmental change before, and it's made a real difference. Now, we need to do more, faster, and we need to do this in a way that is equitable for all people. So what other sorts of change do we need to see in Canada? What does this change look like? We spoke with Caroline Lee, a senior climate policy advisor from the Canadian Climate Institute, to learn more about the specifics.
Affecting the changes required to meet our climate goals is possible. Our last report basically analyzed over 60 scenarios through which Canada could achieve net zero by 2050. And the changes that it showed are all technically feasible. We know that we can design policies that will affect the change that we need. And the change, I don't want to mince my words here, the change that's required to meet net zero is basically unprecedented speed and magnitude. But I truly believe that basically this decade that we're in now is the most critical time to be bending the curve on emissions. We need to use and produce a lot less of fossil fuels. So those are the things that when you burn, produce greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, we need to be growing a whole lot our non-emitting, clean, renewable sources of energy supply. So one perfect example that most people are probably familiar with is electric vehicles. Now we use gasoline for electric vehicles. If you try to use electricity for electric vehicles, and at the same time, make sure that the way in which we produce electricity is super clean, like really, really clean, non-emitting, then that's perfect because that means we'll be driving our cars without polluting. The second thing, when it comes to passenger vehicles, so the cars and trucks that we drive, we basically need to not be selling any more internal combustion gasoline vehicles, and we need to only be buying electric vehicles. For new buildings, so any new building that we're building, it needs to be built in a very energy efficient way. So that means really good insulation so that it doesn't leak heat out in the winter. We live in homes, we work in businesses that are decades old, likely. And that is actually where the real challenge lies, because it's much more expensive to refurbish a building and make it energy efficient. So that's really the next frontier for climate policy, I say, in Canada, in the building sector, is to really think about how we can retrofit more buildings to make them compatible with net zero. I would say carbon pricing is fundamental, but then also this suite of sector-specific and technology-specific regulations. I think you need to implement a whole host of other types of policies, including regulations that are more specific to specific sectors or specific technologies. Also mention that, accountability legislation, which is what we just passed in Canada just this summer, is also really important. I think one really important thing is to ensure that you have a diversity of voices at the table when it comes to designing and implementing different kinds of policies. So it's not just policymakers in Ottawa, but that those policy decisions are being consulted with communities across the country, and in particular with communities that are already marginalized, that already have kind of existing vulnerabilities when it comes to this transition. I think lots of people are interested in advancing climate policy and addressing the climate challenge in Canada. And if that's you, then you are in the climate movement. I think you don't have to be an expert in the field. If you have time, I think it means volunteering for organizations that you see are doing good work. So this is pretty simple, but I think amplifying the agenda, whether it's on social media or whether it's in other spaces, I think can be really important. So the more bodies that we have doing that, saying that climate change is important, helping clarify some of the policies, if that's what you're interested in doing, I think is really important.
Caroline shared lots of ways we can affect change in Canada, and we want to give you a few moments to reflect on what you heard. I'll give you some time to think about what your biggest takeaway from the video was, and then you'll practice talking climate by turning your big takeaway into a message you could share with a friend. Okay, I'll play some music and I'll see you on the other side. All right, I hope it was helpful to have a moment to take in what you heard. For me, the big three takeaways are: change is possible. Caroline talked about the Canadian Climate Institute's report that showed 60 scenarios that lead to net zero, all of which are technically feasible. But it requires strong policy, specifically carbon pricing, that's foundational, as well as sector-specific regulations and accountability legislation. And finally, we need you. Volunteer, advocate for climate policies, and amplify the agenda. Sounds like talking climate to me. And look, you just wrote yourself another climate post. Yay. Did you know that Canada has committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050? But more importantly, they've committed to a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Cutting emissions by half by the end of this decade? That requires us to mobilize quickly. As Caroline said, this is the decade. Now, we might feel overwhelmed by the scale of change, but remember, change happens slowly, then all at once. Terry Fox is known across Canada, but it didn't start out that way. In fact, he didn't really gain much attention during the long stretch from St. John's, Newfoundland, until he crossed into Ontario. Then all at once, he was on every news station and thousands of people were lining the streets cheering him on. And now 40 plus years later, look at the legacy he's left. People who tell you change can't happen are invested in maintaining the status quo. And I'd like you to remember that the scale of change that can happen is only limited by our imagination. So I encourage you to remember the world we got a peek of with Shea Bastida last week, or with Jamie in episode 1, and allow yourself to imagine a rapid shift to a restorative climate safe future. Or just go down a rabbit hole of Googling solar punk. It's an inspiring way to waste a few minutes. Now, last fall, several Talk Climate to Me participants commented that COP26, the recent global climate meetings, were a disappointment. But you know what? Even there, momentum is building. Before the Paris Agreement in 2015, we were headed to 4 degrees of warming, total apocalypse. Now we're on track for 2.7 degrees of warming. Still very dire, but with current pledges, that could be 2.4 degrees. And if countries are successful at cutting emissions this decade, then 1.8 degrees is within reach. As momentum builds, it has a snowball effect. That's why keeping the pressure on to act now is so important. All right, so if change needs to happen and other countries are changing and Canada has changed before, what's the deal? Why aren't we there yet? There are lots of barriers to change. I'm sure you can think of plenty off the top of your head. We want to focus on 4 today. The first is carbon lock-in. This means that fossil fuels are baked into the way society runs. Plastic, cement, transportation, so much of the stuff of modern life is made of or uses fossil fuels. For instance, we use cement for everything, but it's got an enormous carbon footprint. If cement were a country, it'd be the 4th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. They're working on reducing the pollution from making cement, and there are alternative building materials like cross-laminated timber, which is super cool. But because cement is so pervasive, it's an elaborate process of untangling to implement carbon-free alternatives. You know when your necklaces are all jumbled up and it's a big mess to untangle them? That's like this, but worse. The second barrier is that the fossil fuel industry is actively working against the transition. They spent decades denying climate change, and now they're focused on delaying climate action. Exxon knew that burning fossil fuels was changing the climate 50 years ago. Instead of starting on a thoughtful transition, they took a page directly from the tobacco lobby playbook. In fact, they even used some of the same PR firms. They actively sowed misinformation and created a phony debate about whether climate change was real. That denial machine cost us decades where we could have been acting. Another fossil fuel giant, BP, spent millions of dollars on campaigns to focus attention on what we as individuals can do to help climate change, making us feel guilty for not doing enough while blocking the structural changes that would allow us to transition off fossil fuels. It truly makes my blood boil to think that the fossil fuel industry has recklessly endangered our lives. And for what? A few more years of profit? The third barrier is colonialism. As Métis artist and author Christy Belcourt writes, we need to connect the dots between residential schools and resource extraction and child welfare and missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Colonialism views the world in terms of commodities, and the exploitation of nature and people follow from there. In Canada, the implications have been devastating for Indigenous people and for the lands that sustain us all. Ultimately, the twin forces of colonialism and unregulated capitalism have created the climate crisis. In fact, maintaining the capitalist consumerist system that we live in is kind of a thread that weaves through these 3 barriers to change. And we need to revamp this system if we're to create a climate safe future. And these barriers and the efforts to maintain the status quo affects the stories we hear as well. Part of the reason Don't Look Up is getting so much buzz, at least in my climate circles, is that there's so little about climate in mainstream media. Last year, our colleagues at Clean Prosperity surveyed, women's media and found lots of fashion tips and home organization hacks, but almost zilch about climate. Based on that, you'd think no one cares. This is the spiral of silence. If I don't hear anyone talking about climate, I pick up cues that people don't really care. And I don't want to be that person, so then I don't talk about it, which leads others to think I don't care. And the spiral of silence continues. So, do Canadians care?
Why do you think people don't like to talk about climate change?
Maybe they don't know about that.
Because they don't know.
Maybe they don't care about that. I think it's second one.
Yeah, a lot of us think people don't care, but those cues about people not caring, they're dead wrong. 91% of Canadians believe climate change is a serious issue. People do care. But if you ask them if they think their neighbors care, most people think they don't. While almost 60% of Canadians say they've made changes to be more environmentally friendly, only 30% think their neighbors have. The fancy term for this is pluralistic ignorance. Collectively, we're getting the wrong idea about whether people care about climate. That's why it's so important to talk climate. In episode 1, I described how talking climate is simply about sharing that you are concerned about climate and that you are taking action, and it's so that others will feel comfortable doing so as well. This type of talking climate can include, posting online, wearing buttons, whatever. But talking climate can also mean having actual conversations. And those can be kind of hard to start. Like, how do you casually bring up that warming beyond 1.5 degrees will create millions more climate refugees and basically wipe out coral reefs? No one wants to be stuck with that Debbie Downer at the cocktail party. Now, who knows? Maybe you've had great climate conversations, or maybe things, got a little heated, or maybe you didn't engage in a conversation because you felt nervous. Whatever your experience is, we just want to share some tips on talking climate in real life. All right, so here are our top tips. First, share your story. Share why climate change and climate action matters to you. I'm worried my basement will flood is way more relatable than 99.99% of climate scientists agree that climate change is happening. Your personal story is way more effective than hammering them with facts. And if facts worked at convincing people, we wouldn't be where we are today. Number 2, listen with empathy and curiosity. No shaming, no judgment. Try to listen for their fears and their worries. If someone is willing to engage in a climate conversation with you, listen. Your job is not to convince them of anything. That doesn't work anyway. Your job is to be genuinely curious about where they're coming from and to find common ground. Finally, practice. Talking climate does get easier with practice, or at least it feels a bit less awkward to share your passion for heat pumps in line at the grocery store. And just as a reminder, a successful conversation probably isn't going to feel triumphant. Like, you're never going to hear, "Whoa, you blew my mind. I'm quitting meat, never flying, and I'm going to tell my city councilor to eliminate minimum parking requirements for buildings." At best, a win will probably sound like, "Cool, maybe I'll check out that newsletter you mentioned." We now want to give you a moment to try out number 1, sharing your story. Think for a minute, then write down a quick snippet about why climate action is important to you. What brought you to connect with this issue? Or even what prompted you to watch these episodes? I'll play some music and I'll see you on the other side. All right, I hope it was helpful to think of your story, and it's definitely a great place to start when you want to have a climate conversation. And just to make sure we're clear, saying, "But you must realize that if you keep eating meat, you're a terrible human," that's probably not going to land well. And remember, you don't actually have to go there with deep conversations. Talking climate can also mean sprinkling it into your normal life. Sarah's here to explain.
When people think about talking climate change, they think about changing minds, convincing the thorniest and most crotchety deniers. But let's focus on the most literal definition, just talking about the climate, sprinkling it into the soup of your life. A tiny drop of climate concern can spread so quickly and can let the people around you know that you care, that this is important to you. In so doing, you unlock the powerful forces of social contagion. Like in grade 6, when Heather started wearing mismatched socks and then everyone started wearing mismatched socks. She normalized it. That alpha queen bee Heather. It only takes a few people to make talking about the climate crisis normal, and before you know it, you've changed the whole timbre of the room or the feed or the scroll. No need to come out screaming and cursing. Just drop it in there. Share where you're at, why you care, what you love about this world, what you want to see happen, what you're doing. Mix it up and see if you can get the people around you to start mismatching their socks too.
So let's all be like Heather and just role model our mismatched socks of climate concern out there in the world. Talking about climate works. In fact, kids talking to their parents about climate is one of the most effective ways of shifting their parents' attitudes. And the coolest thing, some of the biggest shifts happen when daughters talk to their conservative dads. Talking about the climate crisis makes it normal and makes it less scary for people to share that they care too. But those barriers we talked about earlier can still seem insurmountable. Like, I'm going to bring down Exxon with a tweet or restructure the food system with my Insta-worthy heritage tomatoes. When I think like that, I just feel really small, and I don't think that I, as an individual, can create systemic change. But there is a way that our individual actions can make a difference. It's all about using our actions to create ripples, and then watching those ripples create waves of systemic change. Think of it this way. A young girl was dismayed at the lack of serious climate action. She heard about another girl protesting in Sweden and got inspired. At just 11 years old, Sophia Mather walked out of her school in Sudbury, Ontario. That was the first Fridays for Future protest in Canada. Before long, she'd gone most of her school to join the movement. Since then, she's joined with 6 other young activists in Gen Climate Action, taking the Ontario government to court over climate change. We all have the power to create change. Every time you talk or post about climate or take an action like install solar panels, you're showing that people like you care. That creates a little ripple and encourages others to make ripples too. And as more people create ripples, they can become a powerful wave, a wave of people like us demanding strong climate policies and implementing meaningful change. We can untangle those necklaces. We can defeat fossil fuel companies. We can decolonize our mind and our policies, and we can definitely break the silence. Whether the ripple is coming from top down, like how women in politics leads to better climate policies, or what sewed in matriarchs protecting their lands, or uploading a protest graphic environmentalists for Black Lives Matter that sparked a larger conversation about social justice in environmental spaces, or someone in our own community here just realizing how gross it was that Black plastic wasn't recyclable, so she collected it. Then her friends wanted hers to collect theirs. Now she has bins at a couple restaurants and they're piloting cleaning it and reusing it. There are a million ways to start rippling outwards. Whether you're in a pond or an ocean, your ripples can create waves. And there's something incredible when women work together. And I am very confident that you are those amazing women. So I hope we've shown that your actions can build momentum for changing the larger system. But maybe you're wondering, okay, what exactly should I do? Don't worry, we'll definitely get into that a bit more next time. But we did want to leave you today with a handy flowchart to help organize your thoughts about the types of actions you can take. It's a bit older, it's from 2018, and it's US focused, but as an organizing framework, we thought it was pretty helpful. The link to this flowchart is in the video description. Check it out and see what bucket of, kind of action piques your interest. In the meantime, let's recap what we covered today. We talked about emissions in Canada, how Canada is falling behind and is the only G7 nation where emissions are increasing. We also talked about what needs to change in Canada. We then talked about barriers to change and highlighted 4: carbon lock-in, fossil fuel deny and delay tactics, colonial capitalist policies, and the spiral of silence. We then gave you some tips on how to talk climate and what not to do. And we talked about what we can do as individuals and communities to create the systemic change that we need, creating ripples and momentum by taking action and talking climate. Again, I hope we've shown that your actions can build momentum for changing the larger systems. So let's get to today's calls to action. First, listen to land defenders or water protectors and find out how you can stand in solidarity with them. Again, there's a link to a short documentary on Indigenous-led conservation in our video description. Number 2, practice talking climate. You know, when we asked about your climate story earlier, tell it to someone. Have an in-person conversation or post online or record a 20-second clip and send it to your cousin. Blame us. Tell them it was your homework. But see what happens when you share why this is important to you. Finally, take a small action focused on changing the larger system. Maybe it's calling your MP to say you support bold climate action. Maybe it's looking into where your money is invested. Or maybe it's asking your workplace about installing renewable energy. But these are just a few examples. What else can you think of? And as always, if you're sharing online, please tag us at @TalkClimateToMe or use the hashtag #TalkClimateToMe. Okay, that's a wrap for this episode. I hope you continue on to our last episode, episode 4, where we talk all about flourishing. Again, to watch episode 4, or if you happen to miss episodes 1 or 2, please head on over to Project Neutral's main YouTube page, and we have a Talk Climate to Me episode playlist ready for you. All right, that's it for now. Happy talking climate and see you next time. Bye.